Good evening, and thanks very much. Let me begin by speaking very generally about the topic before I get on to BDS more specifically. The title of our session is Suppressing Free Speech, Criminalising Protest in the case of Palestine and BDS. The topic raises, of course, fundamental and general questions that I want to discuss first as relevant framing for the specific matters that arise that Stuart has discussed in relation to BDS. So I want to talk about those general matters first because I think that helps to give us some context in which to understand the interest of BDS. Now, these are perhaps remarks that I'm not entirely confident about, but they're useful perhaps for me to say things that are something we may argue about during the conversation. I think the title, I think Stuart may have invented it, it's a bit alarmist after all. He spoke about authoritarianism. And I mean, one has to say, after all, here in Australia and in America certainly, this is not North Korea and it's not the former Soviet Union. So it's important to understand the extent to which, while there are these tendencies that Stuart refers to, there's no doubt that we have really quite significant freedoms and opportunities. And the contrast I want to make with that is the fact that we really ought to pay attention to what I think are the much more insidious forms of thought control. And some of you won't be surprised that I'm referring to the long-standing literature of Chomsky and the way he's characterized this. This is perhaps in some ways much more important for us to understand. So I want to talk about that a little bit before I get on to the way in which BDS fits into this picture. Of course, to take the example of these authoritarian regimes in Soviet Russia, the newspapers Pravda and Izvestia, they were of course instruments of official government propaganda. And the important point about that is that everybody knew that and nobody believed what they read there. That's very significant. But we've got a free press. I mean, in some sense, that's right. And everybody believes what they read, and that's the problem, more or less. And the fact of the matter is that editors and journalists are not, after all, told what to write. Even at News Limited, Rupert doesn't actually tell the editors what to say. Of course, he doesn't have to, that's the point. They distort the truth and they act out of bias, out of genuine conviction. And as Chomsky always writes, that's true of intellectuals generally, which is why they're celebrated as public intellectuals. They're not really enthralled to or under the direct pressure of government or the threat of reprisals. Now, of course, mentioning News Limited and Murdoch is perhaps not the best example. A much more illuminating example is a newspaper like the New York Times. The New York Times is, of course, perhaps reasonably, perhaps the best newspaper in the West in some respects, but that's why it's very interesting and illuminating. Now, even for those of us, perhaps most of us in this room, all of us in this room, who have become hyper-skeptical and critical of the media and their biases, what's very interesting from my point of view, after having, assimilated Chomsky's views of the world, it's not transparent and it's not easy to see through when you read the New York Times where the biases are, even if you're kind of sensitized to it. And so for that purpose, it's very interesting to read something like, just in the last couple of days, I have this regular feed from a group called Times Warp. You might look these up. They're extremely interesting because somebody there makes a very careful analysis of what they say and what they don't say. You see, the point about our media, when they distort the truth, they don't generally make outright lies. It's much more subtle than that. And so it's difficult to see through it, and you have to have a lot of independent information. So I won't go through the detail, but there was a recent post by Times Warp, and it looked at the New York Times. Specifically, I'll read the heading from Times Warp: Muzzling Israeli dissent in the New York Times. And the subtitle is B'Tselem's hard-hitting testimony lost in the telling. Now, there was the United Nations event where the Human Rights Organization was testifying, and one of their representatives was speaking eloquently before the United Nations. I won't go to the details of it, but what's interesting is, if you read their account of it, how the New York Times carefully misrepresented it by biasing it towards the Israeli response and ignoring much of what the B'Tselem representative said. Now, this is not lying outright, but it's the way the emphasis and the way in which the tone and other subtle ways in which the media can seriously misrepresent. And I'm talking about one of the best, the New York Times, and it's systematic in the New York Times. So that's an interesting example. So let me get on to other issues more specifically. I want to talk about academic freedom, the version that's of interest to those of us that are specifically at the university, and the way in which our ability to speak freely is also curtailed in increasingly less subtle ways. I looked up today the University of New South Wales's Code of Conduct, and of course everywhere they give lip service to academic freedom, it's become a complete sham. It's completely empty nowadays. For various reasons that I want to mention, again without going into too much detail, they will say, for example, the university recognises and protects the concept and practice of academic freedom. This is just bullshit, actually. And there's a reason for it. And I want to refer to an article where it's been discussed recently in the conversation. Roughly speaking, it has to do with the fact that for all the pious rhetoric about academic freedom and how we all should say what we think, the single important protection for academic freedom has been removed, and the academics themselves are to blame for this, and that was the protection that was offered by tenure. I read a book about this years ago when I was concerned. The Staff Association traded it in for a salary increase. Now, the buildings didn't fall down on that day, but the university, in a certain important sense, disappeared. It's not the institution that it should be or that it was. And the reason for that is that it was the protection of tenure, the removal of the fear of the consequences of saying what you think about anything in the classroom or outside. So there are a number of cases that are interesting that, in a way, prove my point. So, for example, an article appeared in the conversation not that long ago called "University Changes to Academic Contracts Are Threatening the Freedom of Speech." And I can't go into it in detail, but I want to draw attention just to a couple of the key points. The article is all about how you define your area of expertise, as does the university documents, and whether it's easy or difficult to draw a line between where you're speaking about your expertise and where you're not. I actually was at a panel yesterday at the university talking about whether academics should be activists. That's a whole other discussion. But the relevant part of that is whether you are speaking about areas in which you are an expert. Now, that's a trick to prevent you speaking about things which you ought to speak about simply by virtue of being a human being and a citizen, but also things that are completely outside your expertise. Again, I think of Chomsky. Chomsky's always asked, what are your credentials for speaking about foreign affairs and politics? And he says, the same as Henry Kissinger or Madeleine Albright, none. Because he doesn't think any are relevant. But the point I want to make is that there's no sense in which, even if you took expertise or credentials to be relevant, when he's talking about politics, he's not speaking as a linguist. But this is the key. So even these articles that want to defend it, like this one, ends up arguing about whether, for example, where your discipline may intersect with the things you want to talk about. Maybe it doesn't intersect at all. It's the wrong issue. And the article doesn't anywhere mention the key protection of tenure, which is the only real one. So we've lost the plot at universities. And there was a disturbing case recently that I wanted to mention. I'll try and keep it very brief. A woman, Ros Ward, was charged with serious misconduct for posting comments on Facebook about the flag or something. And she was actually suspended from the university. Now, she wasn't sacked, suspended, but that couldn't have happened if we understood tenure, because it wouldn't have been... No, in fact, they reversed that. But the point is that it can't be counted as a victory. They reversed it because the charges were outrageous and what she said wasn't all that awful. But even if it had been, we can't count that case as a victory for our system, and it's revealed by contrast with a comparable case, a parallel case in the United States. An academic called Stephen Slezak, which is relevant now to our interest in Palestine and Israel and BDS. During the 2014 assault on Gaza, he was horrified by what he saw, what we all saw if you bothered to look, and he made some posts on Twitter, I think, which were very strong and highly critical of Israel. And it's a bit complicated, but he had a job offer, and it was a tenured job offer. And the president or the chancellor of the university withdrew the offer and sacked him effectively. Now, what's interesting about this story is that after a procedure, they reversed this. They had to acknowledge their mistake. It was from pressure from the predictable Israel lobby sources, put heavy pressure on them and various other reasons. But the interesting and relevant contrast I wanted to make was the fact that they upheld it on the grounds of tenure. He had tenure that had to be honoured. We can't use that defence here. So for all its failures in America, tenure is still more or less sacrosanct. They understand its principles, but they talk about it, and it's difficult to get. In Australia, we've lost the importance of that completely. Academics themselves have no real understanding of that today. I have a lot of arguments with colleagues about it, and I tend to lose these arguments. Anyway, I won't go on about that, although I had some text here. It had to do with how vile his remarks were, but I want to talk about the vileness of remarks, the failure to understand the point of the institution tenure, and perhaps in the United States, the First Amendment to the US Constitution, and a couple of those cases of people who spoke there, is certainly not the norm in America, but it's here much more widespread. And I mentioned that article. Now, let me get to the boycott and raising questions, the BDS movement, and questions that Stuart asked. What is it about BDS that makes it elicit the kinds of reactions from the defenders of Israel? I want to put it in the context of this idea that some ideas are so vile and so disgraceful that they have to be protected against. Now, the obvious context for us here is the Racial Discrimination Act and the 18C debate. And George Brandis's view that people should have the right to be a bigot. Now, BDS is regularly, disgracefully, in my view, denounced as a version, of course, of the Nazi anti-Semitic campaign in the 1930s. The German words that were daubed on shops in Germany and elsewhere was "Kauft nicht bei Juden," which means don't buy from Jews. And disgracefully, politicians and others explicitly make that comparison of the BDS movement. Now, this is disgraceful because, firstly, I'm not going to give a full-blown defense of BDS as I've done in other places, but in the first instance, the targets of BDS are often not Jewish at all. And this is a terrible and indefensible slur. One Israeli woman, I was trying to think of her name now, I can't think of it now, but she was a former member of the Knesset, said that this is the usual trick. We accuse critics of Israel of anti-Semitism. It's very clear to people that this is a stunt to deflect criticism. But I want to talk about something else. Let me mention the worst illustration of this is a couple of Australian academics, Mendes and Dyrenfurth, who wrote a book about why BDS is terrible. What's interesting about that is that they don't mention anywhere they don't mention the word occupation. They don't mention anywhere what we call the facts on the ground in Israel and Palestine, which are horrible. I'm not going to list them here, that you should know about them. But the relevant fact is they don't mention it as if, to convey the idea that what other reason could anybody have for being critical of Israel except that you're anti-Jewish? You have to be a Jew hater to be critical of Israel. What other reason could you have? And they don't let you know that there might be plenty of good reasons. Now, this is typical and it helps to explain some of the issues that we're facing here. And on this occasion, perhaps, as I've said, there's no reason to argue, as I've done elsewhere, why BDS is not anti-Semitic, or I've indicated some of the reasons. But there's no doubt about the reactions to it, and often sincere on the part of people who really don't know what's going on, especially in the Jewish community, and not least of all in Israel. I wrote in a recent paper to a BDS conference in Tunisia, and one of my colleagues from Sydney University is here who was also there. It's perhaps the most striking fact about BDS activities generally is the stark contrast between, on the one hand, the innocuousness of the activity. Ethical investment or divesting funds from some, cause that you don't think deserves to be supported. So the innocuousness on the one hand, but the extreme severity of the Zionist reactions to them on the other hand. There is a kind of hysterical, often apocalyptic responses, warning of catastrophe, not least of all from people like Mendes and Dyrenfurth, who talk about the delegitimizing of Israel, but in fact the destruction of Israel and undermining the very existence of the Jewish state. This is just insane. So one has to understand where this is coming from. Frankly, I think the best response to these kind of remarks is not rational argument or evidence, but kind of psychiatric therapeutics and drugs. These people are delusional, but it's real. So let's, for the moment, if I could start to wind up a little bit, let's grant the genuine, if perhaps delusional, character of these responses. It seems to me they fall clearly into the category and the definitions protected by the 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act. These people are offended. And rightly or wrongly, they protest that this is so deep and goes deeply to their sense of their identity. In fact, I looked, but I couldn't find an article I read recently. I was trying to find the reference. Some of you may know, recently it's become an issue that the Jews were claiming, as other groups do, that they, as the injured, offended party, they have the exclusive right to define what counts as anti-Semitic or racist speech, hate speech. Really? I mean, that's very dangerous and absurd. Now, you can understand why people would say this, that they're offended and they have the right to decide what offends them, but that just invites the whole conversation about whether we should protect them against that. Well, I don't think so. Now, that opens up the whole 18C discussion. I mean, the obvious question to ask is, what happened to the universal self-righteous posturing about Charlie Hebdo and the right to offend everybody? Perhaps it's only Muslims we have a right to offend, you know. Jews should be protected from it. Now, of course, there's the classic case of the Holocaust denial, which is undeniably hurtful to many, and it's made illegal in places. Well, in my view, it shouldn't be illegal. People are perhaps right to be offended by it. It's not necessarily anti-Semitic, for one thing. So what's the best response? Well, I'm reluctant to agree with George Brandis about anything, I have to tell you, but I can't help it, I agree in this case. He said, people, as you know, you would have heard, people have the right to be bigots. In a free country, people do have rights to say things that other people find offensive or insulting or bigoted. Now, I think it's a deep principle which I want to wind up on. The Shadow Attorney General Mark Dreyfus said that it's a dangerous position to take, and it gives the green light to racist hate speech in Australia. Well, not exactly. I mean, the question is, aren't there any other ways to discourage or combat racist hate speech besides making it illegal? Well, surely we have lots of means. Now, but good friends and colleagues in the audience, they've heard me talk about this before, and I'll avoid giving my usual homily on John Stuart Mill and giving a lecture on other philosophers who've articulated it, but it's important. And in a word, John Stuart Mill is the classic source. Not least of all, Stuart mentioned Socrates. It's not an accident that John Stuart Mill cites Socrates as the example of somebody who was put to death by a society who was, after all, the founder of Western democracy. And he says it wasn't the bad people, it was the good people who upheld the patriotic and religious and other fine sentiments of their time. So he's arguing the case that it's the most detestable views that you must protect. Now that's very counterintuitive. It's the ones that are most hateful, the most offensive. So I want to make a case for that, but I have a reason for making that case. In my view, in view of the imbalance of power, privilege, influence and money, which we're confronting, those of us here, for example, who have the minority position on many of these issues, the dissident position, the Socratic view that nobody agrees with, the Chomsky position. I mean, Chomsky's going to be the first to go to jail. He offends everybody. And I want to say that our best protection, those of us that have these minority positions, we need to uphold this laissez-faire John Stuart Mill doctrine of giving freedom to the most hateful doctrines. In fact, not just giving freedom to it, but protecting them, defending their right to be expressed publicly. Since we're the dissident minority reviled, and we hold these reviled views on BDS and so on, it's precisely this very wide principle of liberalism, of Mill's, according to which it's the expression of the most detestable views that we must not only tolerate but protect. And we have to uphold this not for their benefit, but for ours as ones who need that protection so that we can assert our right to express views which nobody wants to hear. Thank you very much.